Welcome, everyone, to another New Jersey Constitutional Republican virtual conversation. It's my great honor today to have Mr. Jeffery A. Tucker with me. He is the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute and the author of many thousands of articles in the scholarly and popular press in 10 books in 5 languages. Most recently, Liberty or Lockdown, which we'll be discussing today. He's also the editor of The Best of Mises. He speaks widely on topics of economics, technology, social philosophy, and culture. And he can be reached at tucker@brownstone.org. Mr. Tucker, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you.
And we've already discussed we're going to be calling each other by our first names to alleviate a little bit of the formality. But first of all, Jeffery, what I'd like to do is, because there's a lot of people that are going to be hearing the word liberal bantered about between you and I today. And I think it's important that we distinguish, because many people they already have a conception of liberal as being something that we don't believe it is. Mm-hmm. So there's a difference between classical liberalism and what I would refer to as maybe New Deal liberalism.
Yes.
What's the distinction?
Yeah, I think, well, something happened in, I would say, about 1933 to liberalism. I mean, things started happening before then, the progressive era and so on, but that was really the turning point. It was when the left had to acquiesce to corporate fascism or reject it. And they rejected. They acquiesced to it. They rejected traditional liberalism and just redefined what they called liberalism, with New Dealism, which involved industrial planning and price controls, and basically using the police power to manipulate the economy in the name of liberalism. So I don't consider that genuine liberalism. Real liberalism, it was a gradually emerging philosophy from the late Middle Ages that came to terms with the empirical reality around us, which is that society is better off managing itself rather than being managed by some powerful central force. And very crucially, that includes the economy, right? So it's not just about religious freedom, although that was really important aspect of the discovery of liberalism, which is that as long as people leave others alone, then they can believe what they want, and that works out better for everybody. That was kind of an interesting insight that came about at the end of the religious wars. But then it spilled over to free speech, property rights, freedom to travel, freedom of association, and crucially, free economies, which involved the protection of private property and the rule of law and the emergence of constitutions. And that's genuine liberalism. I think it's important that I'd love to recapture the word. I don't know if that's possible, but I would like to recapture, especially the idea, and especially these days. I mean, what happened over, in the spring of 2020 is that there was, news in the air of a pandemic that was coming, a virus that had basically arrived. And the question is, how should we deal with it? And instead of choosing social forces and doctor-patient relationships and social intelligence to deal with it, we put in charge these people like Birx and Fauci, who had extreme and strange ideas about how to deal with pandemic. In fact, their ideas they considered them innovative, as this one word for it. We had never done anything like this in the course of the 20th century. We had pandemics in 1922, 1928, and 29, 1942 to 1945 with polio, and then the Asian flu or Hong Kong flu in 1957-58, and the Asian flu in 1968-69. And SARS-CoV-1 in 2013, H1N1 in 2009, the bird flu in 2006, and so on it goes. So we've had pandemics for 100 years, not just 100 years, but a million years. And we've generally rejected the Middle Ages philosophy of quarantining people and stigmatizing people based on their disease and telling everybody to stay away, and flogging ourselves to death, and setting up a caste system of the clean versus the unclean, that sort of thing. In 2020, we decided to experiment again with medieval style disease mitigation. And saying that, I'm not like smearing the lockdowns. So I'm quoting what the New York Times actually called for. And their lead virus reporter wrote an article It came out February 28th, sorry, which he said to take on the coronavirus, we should go medieval and reject all modern methods we use in the course of the 20th century. Well, that was a huge mistake. I think there's hell to pay. Freedom has suffered, human rights have suffered, and we've got no better disease outcomes, and probably arguably worse, than we would have had if we had just had freedom. So there's going to be hell to pay, which is one of the reasons people keep asking me the question, why does this keep lasting and lasting? One of the reasons it's lasting so long is that they don't want to pay the hell that's coming. They don't want people to wake up, get unafraid, and start dealing with this rationally. Because when they do, they're going to be looking at people like Birx and Fauci and Biden, and for that matter, Trump, and saying, why did you do this to us? This was outrageous.
No question. And a lot of the information that you've already shared with us, Jeffrey, is in this book. And if you don't think I haven't been reading it, you can tell by the condition of the book that it's relatively used.
That's
and
nice.
This is why that's why we are encouraging the people, Jeffrey, to go out and to get this book. And I'll have it posted on the Amazon. We'll have the link to it at the end of the broadcast. But this is the book, and it's so very important. And although it came out last year, it's as relative today as it was when you first wrote it.
Oh.
Of course, now we're dealing with the vaccine controversies at the time. But I do want to read from the very beginning of the book in the introduction, Jeff, and then Jeffrey, and then have you comment. And that is that you say, I've been writing, quote, I've been writing about pandemics and liberty for 15 years. And I knew from 2005 that there were plans in place for mass quarantines. And I knew from 2006 that there were fanatics and that there were those who imagined that they could use the power of the state to suppress a virus by suppressing our freedoms. I found that very, very intriguing to begin the book. And it's certainly, and you bring it all about and flush it out later in the book, but just comment on that because it really gets the reader's attention from the very beginning.
Well, I had been obsessed with this topic from that very early. It was very early on when Bush was frantically giving press conferences in 2005 about the coming bird flu, and I watched those press conferences. I was startled with just the way he was claiming power, that he would make sure that all the food is delivered, that he would divide the workers into essential, unessential, that we'd have social distancing, we'd have separation of people, had really a central plan. And I thought, well, that's really weird. I mean, most people ignored this because we didn't have that element of fear, and he couldn't get anybody whipped up about the avian bird flu for some reason. It's like nobody really cared. So even though he cared. And because he, the thing about George W. Bush is that he was an apocalyptic president. I mean, he was kind of a layabout and that sort of thing. And it's one of the reasons I thought he'd make a good president, is he didn't do much, he didn't care that much. He's just sort of a silly frat boy. But after 9/11, he began to kind of get serious about his job. So he did the shock and awe thing with Iraq and then the Afghanistan thing. He began to get a little bit freaked out about, foreign adversities. And one of the things he was worried about was biochemical attacks in the U.S. So he demanded a plan. And this was in late 2005. He issued an edict to the State Department of Veterans Affairs, to CDC, to all these various agencies, and who then contracted out to others, some sort of consultation of what kind of response we should have in the event of a biochemical attack. And the result was there were two camps. One was the old-fashioned camp led by Donald H. Henderson, was the polio eradicator, who said, well, what you have to do when the pathogen comes is try to figure out its infection fatality rate and then its case fatality rate, and figure out the demographics of vulnerability, and make sure that you get people to the doctor, and start working on things like therapeutics and vaccines. Basically a boring piece of information, the same thing we've done successfully for a century. And then there were these other guys that were mostly not epidemiologists or medical doctors at all. They were computer science guys that had gotten obsessed with the idea of modeling. And one of them was Robert Glass.
Robert Glass, right.
And his daughter, Laura, who was like some sort of probably spectrum-y intelligent child, but she came up with a kind of model of separation, human separation. And she said, in the event of a pandemic, we have to really close all schools because people ride the buses and they're sitting really close to each other and they all spread cooties to each other. So he said, well, that's a good idea. So he put all this in a PowerPoint presentation and converted a few other people, including Carter Meacham of the Veterans Administration, and a few other people. Some of whom have contacted me in the meantime, trying to beg me to shut up about all this stuff. But that was in 2005, 2006. And so they were so compelling in their presentations at the White House that Bush ordered the CDC to incorporate the modeling, social distancing, business shutdown, school shutdown ideas into the pandemic planning. The CDC did not want to do this, but they obeyed with the White House. And they had a proviso in their whole planning, which is that we would only do these things in the event of a severe pandemic. That's a really severe pandemic, like bubonic plague kind of stuff, which they knew by the laws of viruses that, since there's a trade-off between severity and prevalence, the more severe the virus is, the less it travels, and the more it travels, the less severe it tends to be. That's just sort of a law of nature that we've never really be faced with this. So CDC didn't worry about it, but nonetheless, it was in the plan. And well, it turned out the avian bird flu never actually left birds. It's just a few birds got sick, and that was it. I've written about this recently. It's a fascinating story with the avian bird flu, the panic that never happened, really. And so there it sat for 15 years. In the meantime, these modelers started getting more converts, more students. They started populating the universities. And then, of course, Bill Gates got involved with his money and began to fund the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine and the British Medical Journal. And that money just kind of corrupted everything and everybody. And so now, they had their chance in 2009 with H1N1, which, by the way, was a variant of the 1918 flu, which you'd think would have really panicked everybody. It didn't. And then they had another chance in 2012, 2013 with SARS-CoV-1, but that never really left Asia. So enough time went by. And so then we get to 2020, and you have a lot of these people that are really, I consider it to be a Joker style politics. They hated Trump, and they were desperate to create a kind of chaos that they were able to dump on him. They convinced him of the need for lockdowns, which was something of a Herculean effort that Fauci and Birx did. Then Trump got, initially started with the travel bans and the catastrophic March 16th press conference with Birx and Fauci. And then Trump began to think that he was being tricked. It's like, why did I shut down my economy? This is about a month later. So he swore he'd open up by Easter. And then he got scared again. They said, oh, you can't do that because you made such gains over the last month. You have to keep the economy closed. So he's like, oh, I don't know. Well, eventually, you have to fast forward through the summer and get to the fall. He eventually got Scott Atlas in there, who gave him a rich education about viruses. And Trump realized what he had done, but then didn't want to talk about it because he's not the best at admitting error. And next thing you know, he wrote it all the way to the election. And, those last rallies weren't really talking about the virus much at all. He just kind of was dismissive towards it. But meanwhile, people were suffering so much from the lockdowns, they desperately needed somebody to speak honestly and truthfully about this. Well, all that chaos cost him the election. All of his pollsters agreed with this. So it cost him the election. And now we're stuck with Biden. Who continues to be trolled by the same people, Well, Birx is out, but Fauci is still there, whipping up a disease panic and fear, and here we are.
And also thought it was interesting in the book you made reference to F.A. Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society that he wrote in 1945, and talking about institutions creating social intelligence rather than the wise leaders or governors that we have making these decisions. So talk a little bit about that comparison.
Well, it's not possible for people like Fauci and so on to be able to mitigate disease according to a central plan. So one of the things that Hayek talks about these models is that they don't distinguish enough because they don't include enough information on the gradients of risk, right? The risk gradient for anything, not just disease, but for everything, motorcycle accidents, getting hit by years, me falling over and hitting my head on the coffee table, whatever, is different according to circumstances of time and place. And only freedom allows people to be able to figure out what that looks like, not somebody else's plan. But they substituted people's individual plans for their own plans. And it was a kind of a central planning. I mean, it's kind of incredible. It was a different, so there's many forms of central planning. It doesn't just have to be socialism. You can have central planning for every kind of purpose. And in this case, it was disease mitigation. Hardly the first time in American history, by the way. We've attempted this sometimes in the past. I wrote an article yesterday all about the history of segregation in this country, which was all about disease. It was all about the clean people avoiding the dirty people and trying to get away from unhealthiness and avoid unhealthy outcomes. That was the basis of segregation. We're recreating that now with vaccine passports. It's a subject I didn't write about in the book because it wasn't a thing yet. But I mean, it's unbelievable when you look at the racial disparities in vaccines. Something like 2/3 of the vaccinated in this country are white people. And and I forget, I have the data in my article, but it's something like, nationwide, something like only 14 to 16% or something like that of Asians and Blacks are vaccinated. So they're effectively excluded. You can use race as a marker now to find out who gets into the theater or the restaurant or not. And we're recreating the system. And I've yet to hear anybody talk about it. In fact, the ACLU, you wrote an essay yesterday in the New York Times defending all this stuff as being, great disease mitigation policy. It's a disgrace. I mean, there's just a sheer ideological corruption we've seen over the last year. I mean, we really need to get back to fundamentals. What is freedom? What is liberty? What is the Constitution? And why do we have these things? We have these things because we want to fix the rule and law in place so we don't have one generation of politicians and central planners coming along saying, oh, none of that stuff matters. We've got a better plan now. Well, somehow they got away with it in 2020, and they continue to get away with it now. We've got to put an end to it. This is the number one job of all elected officials in this country right now, is to end everything remotely resembling lockdowns and get back to the Constitution, get back to the principle of freedom.
Amen to that. And touch on, Jeffrey, Murray Rothbard's theory on the wig theory and how that is so prevalent today.
Yeah. So that's a big topic. So Murray had this view that humanity was capable of extraordinary error. And not everybody agrees with that, right? So in the late 19th century, there came to be this vision of history, which is that it's always about progress, that every new generation learns from the previous generation, and we get higher and higher levels of knowledge and understanding and wisdom. Murray always doubted that was true. I mean, the strongest evidence that it's not true was that this view came about in the late 19th century. And then, 20 years later, we had World War I, which is a catastrophe. So Murray looks at it and says, look, humanity is capable of making stupid errors when you forget the lessons of the past. So he got obsessed with this topic of forgotten knowledge. And I think, this is very interesting to consider. Why is it that in 2020, so few people seem to have understood anything about viruses, herd immunity, basic cell biology? Like, how did people get tricked into thinking that lockdowns were going to mitigate disease, which empirically they clearly have not? You don't actually hear that much talk about how great the lockdowns were for stopping sickness. You don't even hear that much anymore about how great masking is. People still do it, but you don't hear people bragging about the greatness of masking anymore, because there's no studies that can back it up. That or lockdowns or travel restrictions or anything else, there's no evidence any of this stuff actually works. So Murray, if he had been around today, would have said, we called this an incident of lost knowledge. I think people just stopped paying attention to ninth grade biology, and so they were tricked. So we had a whole generation with just completely lost knowledge of virology. Now, I, like I said, have been writing about this subject for 15 years, so I had a little bit of knowledge about it. But in January 2020, when I knew the coronavirus was coming and I knew the quarantines could actually happen to us, I started refreshing my knowledge. I started reading Cell Biology for Dummies and reading first-year medical school textbooks on viruses and epidemiology and this kind of stuff. Started really boning up on the topic. I don't know, put it plain, not enough people did that.
Mhm.
Still haven't done that. So we have a whole generation with lost knowledge, and this is, I think Murray would say, this is the price you pay. You have to learn from the past. You have to. Every generation needs to educate itself anew and make itself immune to the ideological viruses that are all around us. We have to do that again now.
Mhm. I also thought it was very interesting, Jeffrey, in the book that you shared quite a few Twitter messages describing the excruciating circumstances of many of the people that have fallen victim to these lockdowns.
Yeah, that was a really difficult chapter to write because I just noticed psychologically it's very difficult. I mean, this still goes on now. I mean, I think we're kind of a little more willing to acquiesce to the loss of our freedoms and the sadness of our lives today. But in April, May, and June and July of 2020, people were in shock. Why is it that I can't go to church? How come I can't go to my business? How come I can't see my friends? Why is it that my grandmother's stuck by herself in this old folks home and I can't go visit her? I mean, is any of this stuff actually working? Whatever happened to my freedom? What happened to my human rights? Right. Why is it that we live in the kind of society we do? And just the sadness all around. I asked my Twitter followers to tell me stories, and wow, did I get an earful. Partially what motivated that is I was getting a lot of phone calls in those days from particularly people in their 20s and 30s who were, quite frankly, going into very dark places in their mind. I mean, they were really wondering what's the point of life. And I get it. If you're not free, what is the point of life? A lot of our sense of meaning about who we are comes from our freedom to choose and the belief that we're guiding our own future and that we can travel where we want and take jobs that we want and that sort of thing. And suddenly somebody comes along and says, no, you can't do that. It really does change your perception of what the purpose of life is. And in fact, it takes it away. So that's why we saw such an increase in drug overdoses and suicides. And they're not listed as suicides typically. They're listed as accidental injury is typically the way they're listed. But the demographics of death right now, I published an article on Brownstone yesterday by a German epidemiologist who looked at American data on 2020, and it's absolutely shocking. Basically, the people, I mean, I'll just sum it up for you. I mean, you have to read it to believe it. Basically, right. what he concluded from looking at all the data is that most of the people who, not just most, nearly all the people who died from the coronavirus, on average, died on average the average date at which you would expect people to die. So that was not unusual. But there was tremendous amount of excess death in 2020, probably as much as 20% over regular. And most of those are attributed to younger people under the age of 55 that were not dying of the coronavirus. And those are lockdown deaths. So, and what I mean by lockdown deaths is people killing themselves, people arranging for their death, people denied medical treatment, people who just drank themselves to death, who ate themselves to death, who just let themselves go to hell and died. And the data will indicate this. Now, the CDC says this is the coronavirus. It's nonsense. The demographics do not bear that out. They just don't. This disease is a serious one. All diseases are serious, but mostly we were spared a pandemic that like we had in the past, which typically would affect a greater range of age. This one was mostly older people with comorbidities. So people on average died from the coronavirus, and on average as much, as the average age of where you die. So a tremendous number of the other excess deaths were due to government policy. As I said at the outset, there's going to be hell to pay here. There's no denying this data. It's all going to come out. There's not going to be any suppressing this truth.
And Jeffrey, tell the audience about Santra Gupta.
Santra Gupta is a very interesting theoretical epidemiologist at Oxford, and she has this view. She's really a novelist and a philosopher too, but she has this view that we've come to think about the relationship between the social order and the presence of pathogens we need to rethink this entirely from the way it is to from the way we begun to think about it. And what she says is, and I'm going to turn off my Slack here so we don't get this annoying sound. What she says is that many societies and social orders have been organized around the idea of disease avoidance. And that's what feudalism was, and that's what the caste system is. It's figuring out and allocating privileges according to the clean versus the unclean. And you see this in the Bible, you see this in many parts of the world. But with democracy and freedom, we decided to cobble together the idea of human rights and liberties, even in the presence of pathogens, which requires that we have, forgive the term, but a more egalitarian system where people are not privileged, and so they don't assign the burden of herd immunity to people who are not part of the ruling class, like we did this time, the poor and the minorities and the essential workers, while everybody else is able to live a Zoom life. And so she thinks we have to come to terms with this and get a more democratic and equal way of thinking about this and protect just the vulnerable. Now, vulnerable populations, in this case, turns out to be elderly people with health problems. And that, very crucially, age affects everybody, regardless of race or class or language or skin color or any other, or national identity, religion. It's something that belongs to everybody. So what she calls focused protection, as a strategy for dealing with pandemics, is a much more modern way to think about the relationship of the social order to pandemics. And it's one that's consistent with the idea of freedom itself. And I think her theory here is really important because it helps us understand something that we've not been forced to think about, in our lifetimes. I mean, in my entire life, most people have not thought about disease, apart from being an individual tragedy, but it's not been like a macro social problem, I mean, AIDS, there was a little bit of that going on, but we got through that.
Right.
But with this one, we just completely upended everything we knew about law and freedom and human rights for the purposes of assigning the disease to the working classes while the ruling classes stayed away from it and waited for the vaccine. I mean, that is just wrong and inconsistent with ethics and morality. At least that's what I understand Gupta's theory to be. So I hope to write more about her. In fact, I really think there needs to be a whole biography written of her life and work. I think she's that brilliant.
And of course, you'll be able to read about her in the book. But Jeffrey, we've been teaching our citizens in New Jersey that in the approximately 250 years of American history, with the smallpox epidemics, with various epidemics, with world wars, with this terrible civil war, with all sorts of different calamities that have occurred in the nation. This is the first time, 2020 was the first time that the Constitution was suspended, especially the First Amendment rights of freedom of association, freedom of assembly, religious expression. And the New Jersey Constitution gives the unalienable right, recognizes the unalienable right of every citizen in New Jersey to acquire, possess, and protect their property. Of course, we know that money is property, their business is property, but yet this is the first time in our history that we've suspended the Constitution. And I ran across a quote the other day that I wanted to share with you, thinking about you and all the hard work that you're doing in talking about the Constitution and our liberties. And this was a quote by the great Whig senator from Massachusetts named Daniel Webster. And he was also, incidentally, a great lawyer, argued more cases before the Supreme Court than any other lawyer in American Supreme Court history. But this is what he said, and this is just remarkable. He said, "It is hardly too strong to say that the Constitution was made to guard the people against the dangers of good intentions. There are men in all ages who mean to govern well, but they mean to govern. They promise to be kind masters, but they mean to be masters. They think that they need to be but little restraint upon themselves, the love of power may sink too deep into their own hearts. Hold on, my friends, to the Constitution and to the republic for which it stands.
Yeah.
Miracles do not cluster, and what has happened once in 6,000 years may never happen again. Hold on to the Constitution. For if the American Constitution should fall, there will be anarchy throughout the world.
Yeah.
Very, very relevant to today, wouldn't you think, Jeffrey?
Super relevant. That's the reason we have constitutions, precisely to protect us against things like socialism and lockdowns and these kind of hysterias, you know? I mean, that's why they exist. If we're just going to be governed by whoever happens to have power at the time, Fauci, for example, then we wouldn't need a constitution. We just say, well, let's just put the scientists in charge. No, we put the constitution in charge to keep the scientists from being in charge, to keep the intellectuals from ruining our lives. That's the reason constitutions exist. It's a really fascinating thing. I think we were all under the impression that the court system would protect us, and we're devastated to discover that it didn't really work. I mean, it's starting now a little bit, but a year and a half later, come on. I mean, all this stuff should have been struck down in fewer than 24 hours. I mean, there should have never been. I mean, I'll just give you an example. On March 8th, the conference South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, was stopped by the mayor. Okay. So like the mayor of the town just said, oh, you can't have your conference. There were 275,000 people that were prepared to come to this thing from all over the world and all over the country. And none of them were vulnerable to this virus. I mean, we're talking about mostly young people. It's an arts and technology conference. It's ridiculous. And he stopped it. Now, what should have happened there is that there should have been an immediate injunction by the federal court there in Texas, or the county courts or the state courts, so I don't care what court it was, to have stopped him from doing this and stopped him from denying people their rights and their freedoms and their property. This should have never gone on. It should have ended on March 9th. Instead, he got away with it because why? Because people were afraid of a virus without any knowledge, you know? I mean, we knew within the next couple of weeks, this thing was not going to affect, we knew exactly what the demographics of the risk of this virus were. And, but by then the fear had already been unleashed and people got afraid. And as soon as they were afraid of one thing, then all other considerations went out the window, including concerns about freedom and the rule of law and the Constitution and the normal. So it all began in Texas, March 8th. There was a catastrophic day and it just got worse. I tell you that at the time I wrote about this. My article came out, I think, on March 9th, and I was astonished to discover that I was one of the few people in the whole country to even write about it. I figured that every Republican, every Libertarian would rise up and say, this is an outrage, an act of despotism, and it's got to stop. They didn't. It's just an illustration of how fear can disable rationality. It was
amazing and
catastrophic. Yeah.
Right. And it goes back to FDR's initial inauguration on March 4th of 1933, when he said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And that's exactly the fear that motivated Phil Murphy and Andrew Cuomo and all of the other. And as you say, the Republicans did not bring up a constitutional argument against these lockdowns, which was a tremendous disappointment.
Well, you know, Fauci managed the situation really well. I think it might have been sometime in early March. I wish I had the date exactly right. He was testifying before either the House or the Senate. Again, I'm sorry, I don't remember which. But everybody was deferring to this guy as some sort of, you know, mastermind, sort of genius.
Yeah.
And he threw out infection fatality rates of 3 and 4%. He said, we don't think it's going to be as high as that. But even if it's 1%, that makes it 10 times more dangerous than the annual flu. And he stopped and he looked over the crowd, and in the YouTube I saw of this, you could see the faces of the politicians gathered there, and they all began to turn white, and they began to think that they were going to die. And they developed a medieval style attitude. They're like, well, stay away from me and your germs. I don't want your germs. You know, how can we fix this? And that was kind of the end. I mean, once people, you know, Now, you would think that they would bring in a rational doctor at that point and say, what do you think about this guy? And they could have pointed to things like, we already had the records from the Diamond Princess to know the demographics of this thing. We knew that China was lying about the effectiveness of the lockdowns, and we could have used rationality, but instead we got rid of everything we knew about cell biology and just replaced it with the word of this one guy who is just a specialist in whipping up disease panic, just like he did over AIDS. I mean, this is what he does. And, you know, he keeps doing it. A year and a half later, the guy's a sicko. Now he's warning us about the Mu variant, you know. We've already gotten past Delta and Lambda, and now we're on to Mu. And yeah, that's what he does.
I mean, one after another.
Yeah. The guy needs to go to, I don't know what needs to happen to Fauci, but something needs to be done about him. Yeah.
And this was the same Fauci believed that AIDS was passed on through saliva back in the early 80s too.
Yep. He was responsible for the toilet seat hysteria. That's right.
Yeah. But I wanted to share with the audience as we begin to wind down, Jeffrey, a couple of great points that you make in the book. And that is, number one, that politics should never override the doctor-patient relationship, nor presume to know better what is better for us than our own physicians, number one. And then I think this is very profound. And this is what we need to rally our society, our citizens, the voters around, is that this country needs a serious anti-lockdown movement, one that is not just political, but cultural and intellectual, one that is deeply educated on history, philosophy, law, economics, and all sciences, and can rally around traditional American civic postulates concerning individual freedom and the limits of government, and also around universal principles of human rights. That, to me, is the quote of the book, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Well, that's what we need. And I hope that we're going to come out of this with some good. And part of that good is a more consistent outlook on life, that the Constitution matters, the rule of law matters, that our freedoms and our rights really matter. And they shouldn't be given up for any crisis of the moment. We have to stop this, or else civilization is going to go down the drain. I mean, you think about what we've lost over the last year and a half, how much art, how much science, how much technology, how much we gave up, our perceptions of our own rights and freedoms, how much we've given up and acquiesced to this stuff. It's catastrophic. We cannot live this way. We built civilization by virtue of our deep commitment to freedom as a first principle. And it's one of the great tragedies of our time. Now you see freedom itself being attacked, and that word is being said with a sneer. May it never be so. May it never be so. If there's a movement in this country, a new political movement in this country, it's got to make freedom a first principle and anti-lockdown another principle. And we have to stand in total repudiation of everything that's happened over the last month, lest we die as a civilization. Everything depends on this. The rights and freedoms of our children and their children and their children after that. The future really is in our hands. We either get active and get committed, or we see it all washed away and wiped away by these fanatics we've put in charge of our lives over the last year and a half. We cannot tolerate it. We must stop. We have to risk being ridiculed by our friends. We have to risk being banned by social media. We have to risk our professional reputations. I know people who have now resigned from their jobs, including at the military, and I admire that so much. We have to all make sacrifices. By that, I mean, not stay home, stay safe, not wear a mask at the grocery store. I mean, stand up for what's true and what's right, and learn about the data, learn about cell biology, learn about the Constitution, and stand up for truth right now. It's not the case that these people are going to be in charge forever. They cannot and they will not be. In fact, I think they're on their way out. And a new movement of citizens that are intelligent and smart and dedicated are going to replace them. We can construct a future in which the Constitution and our freedoms really do matter, but it will not happen unless we get active, unless we really care. I can't think of anything more important to do with your life right now than that.
Outstanding. And before we go, Jeffrey, I just want to show our audience, just speak for a moment about the Great Barrington Declaration. It's important for the people to see this. they need to go to JBD or jbdeclaration.org, print it out, send it to your representatives. Just give us a little bit of a description of the Great Barrington Declaration, Jeff.
It happened about this time last year that I got in contact with a few scientists who were saying sensible things. And I invited them to a meeting, and this was the result. Very short. It's a clear statement of public health and cell biology that stands by
it's outstanding.
By a principle of freedom. It was signed by nearly 1 million people in the meantime, and translated into gazillion languages. I don't know how many. In so many ways, it was the most important moment, I would say, of 2020, because it gave people the courage to stand up for what was right and true. It led to the opening of Florida and Texas. It assured the governor of Georgia that he was doing the right thing. And I think it really made history. And of course, it was ridiculed. Of course, it was put down and attacked. But the people who wrote it, I mean, Santra Gupta, J. Bhattacharya, and Martin Kulldorff were great heroes. They risked everything, their careers, their lives, their reputations, everything to get the truth out there. They're great heroes. You see those three names up there, Kulldorff and Bhattacharya and Gupta. They're great heroes because I mean, this is just like the Declaration of Independence in many ways. It's that important for our times. So I'm really proud to have been the organizer and worked with a handful of other people that really got that thing out there. And it's proof that you can make a difference. If you're willing to stand up with moral courage and stick to what you know is true, then you can make a difference. But if you shrink back, if you stay silent and you just worry all the time, then you let people like the Faucis, the Burks, and the Bidens be in charge of history. And that cannot be. They will drive us into losing everything we've fought for hundreds of years. We've got to take back not just the whole world. And this is the way we do it, with knowledge, intelligence, and moral ferocity and courage. And we can win this. I believe it.
That's right. And each citizen can go to this website and sign the declaration. I'm proud to say that I've signed it. And of course, you have a tremendous amount of intellectual power here, and medical people who really know utilize intellectual rigor. And of course, Jeff is a great proponent of that. And we need to be intelligent. Our society needs to be educated. I also want to show, Jeff, before we go, your fine Brownstone Institute website. And here's two articles, Jeff, that you talked about: racial segregation and vaccine passports. You made mention of that. That came out yesterday. And then a closer look at the US 2020 mortality rate, which the German writer was writing about. But this is the site that you're going to want to go to. This is called brownstone.org. Jeffrey's putting out articles on a daily basis to further educate the citizens so that we're able to share this with our friends and our family and with our representatives. Let your representatives know. Let your representatives know. Call them, set up meetings with them, send them emails, let them know that you're learning these things and they need to learn them as well. The legislatures, of course, Jeff, were encumbered really with the onslaught of executive orders, which we challenge the constitutionality of to begin with. Good. We don't find the word executive order in any of our constitutions, our federal or state constitutions. Yet we need the legislature needs to restore their preeminence in a balanced three branch system of government, which has been lost.
Well, and I'm not a very political person, but listen, we've got a new generation of political leaders that is coming along now that's going to be totally dedicated to these principles. I fully predict that the lockdowners are going to go down in massive disrepute, and they're going to be replaced by a new generation of leaders. And it can't happen soon enough, but it's going to happen.
I agree. And we need to perpetuate that and have that escalate and to build that movement to build. And that all requires education. And here's the book on Amazon. It's only $5 on Kindle, Jeffrey, and it's a steal at $15.95 today. So I encourage all of our audience to order this book. It's a great read. You're not going to want to put it down. You saw the condition my book was in. This is very important for citizens to be educated, and we talk, Jeff, all the time about teaching our citizens civics. And of course, civics has to do with learning your rights and then being a good citizen within a civil society. And that means self-governance. And that means participating, making sure you're voting for the right representatives and holding your representatives accountable. That's all a big part of the constitutional Republican movement. Jeffrey, I thank you so much for joining me today. As I said before we went on, I could talk to you for hours, but of course, time and money won't allow that.
Well, anybody can get a hold of me on Twitter and write me at tucker@brownstone.org. And the most important thing is that we stay together and stay active and don't give up, don't give in. We don't want to go the way of Australia. That used to be a very civilized and intelligent, highly educated nation. Now it's a prison state. That cannot happen in the United States, but it's going to be up to us to make sure it doesn't.
Well put. And I want to share with you one more quote, Jeff, before we say goodbye. And that is, quote, "All this is not the result of an accident. It has a philosophical cause. Without the Constitution and Union, we could not have attained the result. But even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There's something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all and gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all," unquote. Spoken by Abraham Lincoln, Jeffrey.
Beautiful. Absolutely glorious. Yeah. Very inspirational. Thank you for that.
As you were too. You really got our audience, I'm sure, invigorated to go out there and to make sure that lockdowns aren't imposed upon us ever again. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
I hope so. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it very much. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.